Tonight on Primetime Politics, asking for more.
You can't build housing without infrastructure.
As Ottawa makes good on a promise to unlock billions of dollars to build rental housing, why are Canadian municipalities calling for more? And what did the Trudeau government miss with its fall economic update? Coming up, we'll speak with Halifax Mayor Mike Savage about the issue. Also,
next year, we will spend more on debt interest in Canada than we do on healthcare.
It's not just the Conservative leader who's raising the alarm. Business groups are also concerned about the Trudeau government spending and the lack of any plan to get back to a balanced budget. And as Israel and Hamas reach a deal on a release of hostages and a 4-day ceasefire, we will hear from former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. We'll get to those stories in a moment, but we begin tonight in Niagara Falls, New York, where the Rainbow Bridge crossing from Niagara Falls, Canada to the United States is currently closed. This follows a vehicle explosion that killed 2 people today at that crossing. Earlier, there were concerns what happened was terrorism related, but tonight the New York governor says there is no indication what happened was a terrorist attack. Officials are still investigating, trying to piece together what did happen. But again, Governor Kathy Hochul says this was not terrorism. She would like to calm down any speculation, and because the debris field from this explosion was wide, the Rainbow Bridge will remain closed. But other crossings from southern Ontario into New York State have been reopened. Well, let's turn now to some reaction to the government's fiscal update. With the federal government doubling down on its housing initiative yesterday, committing billions to build rental homes and to help develop more social housing.
Building on the significant action we have already taken, including this fall alone, I am today announcing new measures through our economic plan to build thousands upon thousands upon thousands of new homes across the country and to build them faster.
But Canada's cities are still looking for more, and to talk about that, we're now joined by Mike Savage, Mayor of Halifax and Chair of the Big City Mayors Caucus with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Mayor Savage, good to speak with you again.
Nice to see you again, Michael.
Now listen, the Trudeau government obviously made good on this expected announcement. $15 billion for rental housing development, $1 billion for social housing. But I take it that's being greeted with what, some reservation? Is that fair to say?
Well, we're very appreciative of the investments that the government has made in housing. Halifax was one of the first cities to sign on to the Housing Accelerator Fund, for example, with targets that we both agreed upon and make a lot of sense. Our concern with a lot of these investments is they don't come with any infrastructure money. You can't build housing without infrastructure. People expect to have water when they run the taps. People expect transit. People expect some green space, some parks and things like that. That's just a normal part of life. So building housing is one thing. We don't just want to build units where we store people. We need to build communities where people can actually live. And so we need the other orders of government to recognize that that's an important part of building the housing that we need.
Okay, other orders of government, which of course includes you, because, we heard it from Chrystia Freeland last year that Ottawa would not be able to write checks to solve every challenge. So where does the province fit in? Where do municipalities fit in terms of finding the funding that's needed to create this infrastructure?
Well, I think it's obvious that we all need to play our role. So we want the province involved in these discussions. And I think, frankly, a meeting between the feds, the provinces, territories, and I think also with First Nations governments as well is what we need. But in the meantime, we all have to play a role. So cities, what do we do in the building of housing? We approve it, we plan for it, but we don't build it. We don't actually build the housing. If we're going to build housing, it's not just a matter of saying we'll put houses here, an apartment here, we'll do this here. There has to be infrastructure around them. And so to identify that we're going to spend money on rental housing is a good idea. To look at Airbnb across the board is a good idea. These are all really good things. But for us, it comes down to the fact that somebody has to build the infrastructure for the housing. You can't just put a house there with no water line into it. And municipal governments simply don't have, the wherewithal or anything close to. Our revenues are not rising like federal and provincial revenues are. So we have to look at this all together.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, they're calling for this new municipal growth framework. Could you walk us through that? How would that work?
Well, I'll give you an example of Nova Scotia. In Nova Scotia, the population has been growing significantly. We're over 1 million people now. That's quite heralded. But the growth is being driven in a lot of communities, but primarily in Halifax. 80% of the new people who've come to Nova Scotia settle in Halifax. They expect certain things when they settle there. They expect a house to live in. They expect transit. They expect water. They expect schools. And a lot of these responsibilities are the responsibility of the municipality. So that's the cost side. On the revenue side, when they come to Nova Scotia, they start paying income tax almost immediately. They start paying sales tax. In a lot of cases, they're paying corporate income tax. In some cases, they're not paying property tax for a delayed period of time. In some cases, it could be a long period of time, but it also doesn't necessarily equate to the growth of the city. So we're saying if we all want growth, if we want to drive immigration in Canada, which we do, which I do, let's just more equitably share the revenue that comes with that. There was a news article that said the provincial government in Nova Scotia last year discovered $2 billion more in revenue than they had budgeted. $2 billion. The city of Halifax, with 80% of the growth of Nova Scotia, we had a $54 million increase. So the money is not accruing fairly. And if you're going to build infrastructure, then we should all look at that and say, how are we going to do it in a way that's fair and equitable?
So what are you looking at here? An annual lump sum, a percentage of taxes? How would you work that through?
Well, we're not being completely prescriptive, because it would be wrong for us to say it has to be A when there may be a better appetite for B. So I think something that recognizes the growth and the fact that property tax simply does not keep up with the kind of growth that we're having. So, there is a fund that people have called the gas tax for a number of years, set up by Paul Martin, made permanent by Stephen Harper, and indexed. That's an avenue that we think could be helpful. You could be looking at a percentage of sales tax. We're open to the ideas that other orders of government have, and we recognize that we're not going to come to the table with just our hands out. We want to be partners. We want to build housing for citizens and communities where people can live, and that we all have a role to play, but we should share that burden of that infrastructure.
Okay, as you talk about this, I can't help but think back, because Ottawa is already, as you know, getting flack from some provinces for making deals and announcements with cities instead of going through the provincial governments. What's your reaction to that?
Well, my first reaction is let's all do it together. I'd be delighted to have the provinces involved. The vast majority of funding that goes to cities from the feds goes through the provinces. Infrastructure money, public transit money, green infrastructure, social infrastructure goes through the provincial government. Even last year, when the feds agreed to provide some support for operating costs of transit, it had to go through the provincial government. And that can be fine, but I don't think it's necessary. But if the provincial governments are sensitive to that, then let's all sit down and figure it out, especially if the province is prepared to contribute to those costs in a way that makes sense.
Mayor Mike Savage, really always appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Good to see you, Michael. Thank you.
Well, it's not just the Federation of Canadian Municipalities looking for more from Ottawa, so is the Business Council of Canada. But rather than more spending, the Council wants more prudence, concerned about the government's rising debt and what that would mean for future investments into the country. With more, we're now joined by Goldy Hyder, President and CEO of the Business Council of Canada. Goldy, always good to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Good to be with you.
Listen, I'll begin with the opening line of your press release, which said the federal government's fall fiscal update fails to set the country's finances on a sustainable path. How does it fail to do so?
Well, look, this is a government that has not had a very good track record on a number of things. One is it spends a lot of money. And 2 is whatever it says it was going to spend, it ends up spending more. Okay? 3 is they make a bunch of assumptions that are very favorable on economic growth, but not so much on the spending side in terms of bringing that down. And when those things don't add up, if you have inflation, if you have the possibility, which this economic statement completely rules out of any kind of a recession, which is shocking, given what we're seeing in many parts of the world and the likelihood that we may well have a slowdown. So the consequence really, Michael, is that leads to a credibility problem. And that's what we're saying here. We have a track record we can look at. And I think that's why what you're seeing today, the day after, the morning after and the day after, is people are really seized with a fiscal question in this statement.
Okay, but the Trudeau government does point to its debt to GDP ratio. They say it continues and will continue to go down in the years to come. And they also say that ratio is the best of all G7 countries, rather. What's wrong with that analysis?
Look, first of all, they've had moving targets on what it is that they measure. They used to be called a fiscal anchor. It became guardrails. Now it's coming back, and they used to be debt to GDP ratio. Now it's the GDP ratio versus borrowing. It's all mumbo jumbo to the average Canadian out there. The question really is, are we spending too much money? And the answer is yes. And here's what concerns us. We genuinely agree with any government that says we're here to help the Canadian people. The way you help the Canadian people is not by making them broke, is not by spending more than you make. It's by growing our economy so that the programs that are being announced have long-term validity and sustainability. There is no point announcing something if it's going to get cut or canceled outright because somewhere down the road we're not going to be able to afford it. And as far as the comparisons go, I can give you 20 other stats about where we're struggling on growth and so forth. I think what Canadians are more concerned with is what's happening in Canada, what's happening at home, what are the things that we can do to control our own destiny, and not be worried about, are we taller than the shortest person in the room? That doesn't matter. You're still short.
Okay. Well, one thing that your organization is suggesting is to limit the cost that it takes to service Canada's debt. And by that, you want to limit the federal government to no more than 10% of the revenue going to service that debt. Wouldn't that mean massive cuts to actually reach that target?
No, again, there's two sides to this ledger here, right? Let's grow our economy. Let's work on having a long-term growth strategy. Let's work on our productivity challenges. Why don't business and government and labor and Indigenous groups come together and say, where can we find the opportunity to bring about economic growth? I travel the world and people say, God, it must be so great to be Canada. You have everything the world really wants. You've got energy, you've got food, you've got critical minerals, you've got proximity to the United States, you've got trade agreements, you've got clean electricity, you're an innovative society, you've got immigration policy. Let's use these assets in our country to put more emphasis on the growth side of the agenda. It seems to me that this is a government that spent far too much time in trying to basically redistribute the wealth that's trying to be created, as opposed to expand the pie and grow it.
Okay, expand the pie and grow it, but that does take time, and right now up against that are housing concerns and childcare and dental care, EV battery plants. Are those not worthwhile to go into debt in the short term to try to bring about the kind of growth that you're referencing?
Well, look, when it comes for some of these programs were already announced in previous iterations of budgets with a fiscal framework of some kind. What we're concerned by here is there is no fiscal framework. You cannot say that we're going to be fiscally responsible, but not tell me how. And so what we've been saying is very specifically what the so-called David Dodge model is: just bring your spending under control so that borrowing costs don't increase or are not in excess of 10% of your revenues. This way, it forces you to have some discipline on the program announcements and make sure that we have the growth to support it. Currently, as things are tracking, I think it's very convenient that this year the deficit is showing to be exactly what was forecasted just 9 months ago. It's the first time they've ever been able to do that, actually. But it looks more like moving a shell game here, or a little bit of gerrymandering going on, because the deficit grows as we go further down the road. In fact, we've been using the analogy, and I know others have picked it up, that you're about to spend the same amount of money on borrowing costs that you're spending on healthcare. That is a shocking statistic for Canadians to hear.
Goldy, always appreciate the thoughts. Thank you for the time today.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
That's Goldy Hyder. The eyes of many world leaders will be on the Israel and Gaza border tomorrow because early in the morning, some 50 Israeli hostages are expected to be returned by Hamas. In exchange, 150 Palestinian women and children currently in Israeli custody will also be released, and a 4-day ceasefire will begin. News that was welcomed here in Ottawa.
This humanitarian pause is what Canada and others have been calling for weeks now. It is going to allow for hostages to finally be liberated. It's going to allow for significant amounts of humanitarian aid to get into the civilians and the innocent people in Gaza who desperately need it. And it's going to allow for protecting of civilian life, including hopefully getting even more Canadians and foreign nationals out. This is an important bit of progress, but we have to redouble our efforts now to get towards a lasting peace.
Now, that lasting peace is something I discussed with former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. He took part in the Halifax International Security Forum this past weekend, and while some Israeli leaders no longer believe in a two-state solution, it is a framework which Ehud Barak believes must be revisited, but only after the removal of Hamas. You were saying in the discussion that ultimately you believe in the two-state solution, but of course the current Prime Minister has expressed serious reservations about it. What do you say to Netanyahu's reservation to a two-state solution?
First of all, the first thing that I said in this session is that it's not the right time. Our youngsters, while we are speaking, it's already night in Israel. They are getting into the tunnel, getting into those buildings where can expect a kind of a terrorist behind every corner. They have to be the first to pull the trigger. That's not the right timing, so to speak, to talk about future intentions in the longer term. But having said that, I might say that Netanyahu is wrong and I'm right. I cannot say a lot more. The problem is that he is slightly more than half of the people, and he's Prime Minister, and I'm a former Prime Minister, but I'm not active now in politics, and somewhat less than half of the public support my position. I think that they are blind to the realities, and when I explained that Israel should be interested in two-state solution, not because of justice for the Palestinians, because of our own interest, our own future, our own security, our own identity. We need it because Israel is established in order to become a Zionist, democratic, liberal democracy, I believe, in its nature, and that's not the case going to happen if we have control over the whole area. It will become either non-Jewish or non-democratic, and neither of these is the Zionist dream.
If you were to follow the current course that we're seeing Israel carry out in its war against Hamas, what do you think will happen? Will Israel have to reoccupy? Will it have to go to an international force? How do you see this unfolding?
It's not, no one in Israel really intends, probably except for the extreme right-wing kind of zealots. No one expects Israel to take over and hold the Gaza Strip with over 2 million Palestinians for the next 10 or 20 years. So we all think of making the operation. However, it might take, it probably take several months to fully make sure that Hamas military capabilities had been erased and it has no capacity to reign over the Gaza Strip. So we think of this term as a term that we will be there, not occupied forever, but we will be there for several months. And I personally believe that the right answer for the day after is that while we are fighting there, together with the Americans and the whole axis of moderate forces in the Middle East, mainly the Sunnite autocracies, Egypt and Jordan, MBS, Saudi Arabia, MBZ, the Emirates, probably in a different way also the Qataris, because their financial cloud can help. That the Arab group will establish a multinational Arab force that will be ready to take over the Gaza Strip from us once we destroy the Hamas capabilities for a limited period, let's say 3 or 6 months, backed by Arab leaders, also probably even United Nations Security Council resolution if the Russians will not veto it, and take over the Gaza Strip and bring back the original owner, so to speak, internationally recognized owner, which is the Palestinian Authority. They are now in the West Bank, but bring them there and help them probably stay another 3 months or 6 to help them to make sure that they are capable of holding it. That might be the solution. Of course, it contradicts the present government position that they do not want to feed them. And I think that they are wrong, and I'm right. Mm-hmm. And I think that the only realistic solution that will save Israel the experience of coming once again to control 2 million or whatever Palestinians that take care of everything from social security, education, sewage, supply for babies or for hospitals. So that should be run by Palestinians. Mm-hmm. And of course we should make many arrangements on the security side, both along the barrier, probably cordon sanitaire a few hundred meters beyond the barrier, to make sure that what we experienced in the October 7th cannot ever repeat itself. That's our main interest. To make sure that this phenomenon of the slaughtering of 1,200 people, abduction of another 250, cannot happen ever again.
Mm. Now, of course, a precursor to that, and you said it, is to make sure that Hamas loses control, never gets back power again in Gaza. Yeah. With both your political and your military background, what is that actually going to take? Because right now, we're, as reported, thousands of civilian casualties as a result of this operation. What will it actually take, do you think, to get rid of Hamas and make sure they don't take power again in Gaza?
It will take more time and toil and sweat and tears and blood. That's the nature of war. I hope minimal loss of death toll for ourselves, and I hope also that minimal damage to civilians who do not have did nothing wrong except for being held under gun to the temple by the Hamas people. Out of the over 1 million people in the northern part of the Gaza Strip moved to the southern part, already moved on foot. It's not unlike Canada. We are a tiny country, much, I believe even smaller than Nova Scotia. But very tiny, so in the Gaza Strip, which is probably 120 square miles, they can walk on foot from the northern part to the southern part, and you can see it on TV every afternoon. Several thousand, probably tens of thousands are moving. Now there are only 150,000 people held under point of a gun by the Hamas as a human shield. But 150,000 is a lot too many to be killed in attack. So we are doing our best to minimize it, to avoid it. We do not enjoy seeing innocent Palestinians being buried, but we have a compelling imperative to make sure that Hamas is destroyed physically and as a potential power to reign over the Gaza Strip. And I prefer to see Palestinians coming there and taking control, backed by the Arab world. They've been financed by the Arab world to develop, to rebuild, to create of it a normal place for human beings to live.
Our conversation with the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. You can see our full discussion this weekend right here on CPAC on a special edition of Profile as we focus on the Halifax International Security Forum. We also have interviews with former Ukrainian Ambassador to Canada Andriy Shevchenko and former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko. Time now for a look at the other stories making headlines today. A day after the government delivered its fall economic statement, and the head of Canada's central bank says high interest rates have helped get inflation under control. Tiff Macklin defending the rate hikes, telling a group of business leaders in St. John, New Brunswick today the bank had no choice but to raise interest rates to deal with the soaring cost of living.
This tightening of monetary policy is working, and interest rates may now be restrictive enough to get us back to price stability.
Macklin says while there are positive signs in the Canadian economy, if high inflation persists, the bank may need to raise its rates again. An update to share tonight on Canada's space program. Innovation, Science and Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne announcing today that Jenny Gibbons will serve as the backup astronaut for Canada's mission to the moon. She will replace fellow Canadian Jeremy Hansen if he is unable to take part. And Joshua Kutrick will embark on a 6-month mission on the International Space Station. When he takes off sometime in 2025, he will be just the 4th Canadian astronaut to take part in a long-duration mission on the ISS. And just weeks after unveiling sweeping changes to its healthcare system, the Alberta government says nurse practitioners will soon be able to open their own clinics and take on patients. It's an effort to recruit more highly skilled workers and improve access to primary care providers.
By creating opportunities for nurse practitioners to open their own offices, we have the added ability to add more primary care providers for Alberta families. This would represent a significant positive outcome for tens of thousands of patients. Actually, we were just talking about it, hundreds of thousands of patients, in fact.
The Alberta government says the new model will be in place by early 2024. And that is our program for this Wednesday evening. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow. But up next, Estelle Bégin avec l'essentiel.